that anything was going to just.
Yeah, she always does. But one, she's just so confident. She doesn't.
I don't know, I was having trouble with data. I don't know. But I was like, it's clear, I don't know. So I looked at it and I'm like, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, actually, it's a good one.
I know, it was like almost like straight.
Yeah, it's not. Listen.
This was the first day I kind of got chilly.
I was saying, like, I know a whole other sweeter, so it's always
Connecticut, right? Yeah.
It's like 30.
Easy, and regular.
Oh. You know what, like, we had like little, like, small ice storms, sorts of things, but nothing.
We had one where it was a little bit of snow, but it melted and froze pretty good.
Yeah, thankfully, we usually, like, up until now, like January, it's just cold, and the real snow doesn't start until February.
Yeah, that's kind of how it's January. February.
Yeah, February is bad, and then of course we have a snowstorm in March. I remember a couple years ago, we actually had snow on April Fool's Day, and it started to snow. And then by the
When I lived in
afternoon,
Iowa, we had snow in April. It was so demoralizing to everybody.
it was, but this was the funny part. It snowed, and then by the afternoon, the sun was shining, and it was 50 degrees. So it's like welcome to Connecticut.
For those taking time for MA, Iowa. The snow never, like in Ohio, the snow never accumulated.
Yeah.
By the end of the winter, the snow started parking the streets. So there was a tiny little walk for like sidewalk. Snow is freaking out.
Thank you.
No.
No.
It never melted.
Where are you from?
Yeah.
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York?
Yeah.
Every once in a while we
Exactly. So
have
this
like
is my snow time. I'm just trying to wait it out, hopefully.
It's like
Where are
it's
you
May
from?
and
Florida.
it's still snowing.
I'll see. God bless. I wish they would do this stuff in Florida, to be honest.
They have a campus down there. Although I talked to my daughter a little while ago, and it's even cold in Florida, for Florida,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah,
Not like
that would probably be hot for me right now.
Probably. But nevertheless.
Right to do
Right now.
all the craziness. And they all are. I mean, you know, sometimes people are upset about it, but there's nothing wrong about it. So there's no point in being grumpy.
I'm so sleepy.
Is it annoying? Yes. But I never like.
I had a little.
First day
Yeah.
I wake up early.
I have some rental in my car. It's no $50 for
And
it.
that was both of my rain or whatever.
Then they charge like $130.
Yeah. I had a teeny bottle. It's like one glass worth.
And she goes, and then she'll start it.
It's a most of you know. Yeah, what was the $130?
Because they said it was a whole after I called them twice and asked them.
Isn't that funny?
But usually it's only
Really the end for us.
Yeah, I was like,
But
oh,
everything's different.
it was debit card. And I asked them specifically about debit card.
You may not be charged everything. There is some deep conversation.
I'm good, how are you? And then it's not even like there's no reason to have it because it's not like there's food there. So like what's the point of having it? It's an incidental charge.
Like they don't do.
Do you know for the first time?
I mean, I remember.
For the first time last night, I went on to the new system.
Stand in their
Oh,
lobby.
I was looking for something. When I went to this one, right? I was looking, I think, for my syllabus or just whatever classes for today. They texted me and it was all sort of blanked out in the first page. It made me feel like something was wrong. Because because it also like, whatever.
Right. Right.
So, but I wanted to come to my classes, and I had some conversation.
Right.
Yeah, I even called before I got here, said, what is the hold?
Yeah, that's what I
And they're like, oh, it's $50. I was like, okay. So I have the budget. The only thing I had was card I'm using for what?
Right,
So
right.
why did you take $80 out of one off?
So like I had to like call my mom after, another $100.
I'm gonna have to go to the bank.
I quit like 5 times.
Are you serious? They put the $50 loan on the check in, and then they took out $80 last night.
Oh.
Yeah. And he said, I don't know why he did that.
Well, you need to know.
For wrong reasons, but
But you know why he took it out.
Right.
You know what I mean?
it was like to deal with stuff at home. And once all that stuff was together, then I'd be like, I gotta check my finances. So a lot of times I would just wait for it. Wait, not in that world.
Yeah, it was really weird. I was like, I bought 4 pieces of bacon.
4 pieces of bacon, $130.
And the fact that they charge you for it, I was saying like, since half the stuff is together, and they're like they would like a discount or yeah.
But I don't want it to be like this, you know what I mean? I was gonna say, graduation speech. I don't really care.
So I think our moderators may be running a little bit late, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And then we'll keep it down here. So, thank you everybody for coming to our session. It's very bright. Sorry about So welcome to our panel. I want to introduce our presenters to you. We're going to have 3 presentations this morning. Our first presentation is going to be from Dr. Paul Rene Tamburo, who is one of our newest faculty members here. Dr. Tamburo received his PhD in anthropology from Indiana University. He also has an MA in linguistic anthropology from Indiana University, an MSW from Salem State University, and an MA in refugee services and linguistics from the University of New Hampshire. He has been the chair of social work at Indiana State University and Thompson's River University, Canada. He's been the director of the Reservation-Based Community Determined Program through Evergreen State College and Northwest Indian College in Washington State, and also has been faculty at a number of other universities and colleges. He is an artist, a traditional singer and dancer in the powwow circus, and an indigenous language educator. I also want to introduce Frida Grant, who will also be presenting. Frida Grant is a proud member of Cohort 23. Cohort 23 people in the room, they're quietly, you know, quiet this morning. Cohort 23 in the public policy and social change concentration. Her research interests include sexual and intimate partner violence policy and its impact on Black women. She has a master's degree in women's studies from Southern Connecticut State University. And currently, she works as a sexual and intimate partner violence advocate and counselor for Yale University's Sexual Harassment and Adult Response and Education, otherwise known as the SHARE Center. She has an upcoming publication titled Black Feminist Analysis of Intraracial Sexual Violence Within Black Women's Intimate Relationships, which will be featured in the upcoming anthology Conceptualizing Sexual Violence in Marriage, Research and Policy. And she also has a presentation which will be happening at the 2020 National Association of African American Studies, which is going to be held in Dallas, Texas. And her presentation will be Black Feminist Analysis of Intraracial Sexual Violence Within Black Women's Intimate Relationships. Our third presenter is Jennifer Raymond. Jennifer Raymond is currently the interim dean of the PhD program in interdisciplinary studies at Union Institute University. previously the chair of the Public Policy and Social Change Concentration. Dr. Raymond joined Union Institute University in 2011. She holds a PhD in Public Policy and a graduate certificate in Women in Politics and Government from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her research interests focus on gender, sexuality, and social policy, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, with a particular emphasis on same-sex marriage. Prior to receiving her PhD, Dr. Raymond was a senior research associate at the Center for Social Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she conducted research and program evaluation on welfare, homelessness, and poverty. In 2013, she received a fellowship at the Summer Institute in LGBT Population Health through the Fenway Institute at Boston University School of Public Health. So thank you for being with us this morning. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Tim Bora.
Wasn't sure of the format. Now I'm thinking I should have brought a whole bunch of slides, make some pictures better than reading out of the paper. A lot of the time when I talk about indigenizing the academy, I'm talking to on a reservation campus or reserve campus in Canada, whatever. So I'm sort of out of my element here in the sense of place. So situationality is extremely important when we're talking about indigenous perspectives. And one of the things that my wife made sure that I remind everybody of is that this is her territory where we are standing right now. We always need to acknowledge the ancestors. She's Shawnee. This is Shawnee land. I know it's been named Cincinnati, but that's the whole topic of my paper here. That's only from a couple of hundred years ago. We've got 16,000 years of history. In order to focus myself and to situate myself, which I need to do to bring myself and this place and the people around here into balance, I need to do something in my own culture. There was something that we always did, I knew to do in other places, and I would always have a drum in my car, because you never know when you're going to need one. I didn't bring one here, but my elders had always just been able to use the hand, so I'm going to first acknowledge the ancestors here, and I'm going to sing a prayer song. The words to this one are Wakanda Vitambaga, which means Creator, we are here. Elushketa Deshkete Bakte Pipa, which means we're doing this dance of life here. Help us with this dance. This will help me hopefully get centered here to place. It's one of the languages that is from here. Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Helushketa Deshkete Pape Ogipiba, Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Wakanda Hange Wakanda Hange Tombaga, 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 Helushketa Deshkete Pape Ongipiba, Wakanda Hange Tombaga, Wakanda Hange Tombaga. Some of you may have read the abstract, so I won't go through that. That's published in the paper, and I know we're limited by time. Indigenizing university curricula. Almost 20 years ago, I was hired to assist in an effort to Aboriginalize the context of courses taught at the University College de Caribou, now Thompson Rivers University in British Columbia. In Canada, it is generally acknowledged that human and health service professionals will have clients who are from Indian, Métis, or Inuit, under the Canadian Constitution, all recognized as the Aboriginal people since 1984. However, the curricula had little content on the First Peoples of Canada or the Americas in general. Canada has been through various regulatory and accrediting bodies which have begun requiring institutions of higher education to incorporate more content into curricula, especially in fields of study such as education, human services, and healthcare serving human beings. The Indigenous peoples of Canada, as in the United States, have histories going back 16,000 years, separate from Europe or Africa or Asia, except for occasional and often poorly documented possible trade. Despite this long presence and the resulting worldviews and knowledges that developed here in this continent, European colonizers have imported a system of education that ignores the fact that they are no longer in Europe. Academic institutions, as any introduction to history of education will attest, are patterned after monastic educational systems developed from the European Middle Ages. The symbolism is replete with symbols such as hoods and black robes referencing authorized Christian dispensers of the official approved reference to knowledge. Educators wear similar garb and use similar symbols to those of judges and the Christian priests who derive authority from similar cultural and historical sources. Specifically, the content, along with its accompanying symbolism and institutions, were designed to support a modern, positivist, and objectively obvious hierarchy from kings to servants. The founders, such as Locke and Newton, of this once radical modernism, which promised to take academics away from the darkness of the Middle Ages to the new age of science and objective reality and the age of modernity, believed strongly in the divine right of kings and nobility over ignorant, in quotes, peasant women who spun, quote-unquote, old wives' tales. That's what Newton used to refer to his upbringing when he was sent out to the country, and he resented the old wives' tales tremendously and therefore wanted to be scientific. All knowledge and official blessings for academics in what constitutes civilization and education has its origins in officially approved connections to hierarchical, quote-unquote, civilizations and structures of the European elite. In this scenario, it has been a foregone conclusion that knowledge is from the old world, which is ironic for our people here who've always been here. Texts such as the Judeo-Christian Bible, the works of Greek and Roman scholars, and newly incorporated sciences from the Orient, in quotes, with connections to Islam and China, continue to be favored over indigenous knowledges in the development of higher education, in quotes again, in the Americas. The model for formal education, therefore, in all Americas was imported directly from Europe, often with a sense of an inferiority complex. Obviously, what I mean by that is, are we really here? We need to make it ours. Obviously, whatever came from Europe must be better, since it is assumed to represent the culmination of progressive European history. In the colonies of England, there was also a missionary zeal to educate the newly found people here. Harvard in Massachusetts, Georgetown in Virginia, and other institutions were specifically developed to focus on educating American Indians in the Christian religion, in this case Protestant forms. The best education, however, was still seen as one conducted in Europe, so the sons of materially wealthy European colonists have often sent their offspring to European institutions if possible. Some still do. With this background, we come to the point of this essay. What happens now to the educational models in this new United States and Canada? Most of the states and provinces have only been English-speaking and focused on Europe for 150 to 200 years, in comparison to 16,000 years of settlement by indigenous American people. I think they said Cincinnati, 1788 to 12. Any of you who have been to Europe know that there are dates earlier than that institutions are based on. So in a search of approximately 5,000 U.S. colleges and universities conducted in preparation for this paper, only about 30 had departments that included Indigenous or Native American studies. Many of these were attached to as a minor option to history, law, or English literature departments. A recent 2015 study by Shear et al., I have the sources here if you need them, of current K through 12 education standards for content on Native Americans demonstrates that many states only provided content for Native Americans dealing with issues before the 1900s. Almost all educational content, some states such as Wyoming had none, was related to the more distant past and focused around periods of conflict, such as wars. Therefore, it is clear that very few educated, in quotes, people in the USA have any formal knowledge of this continent that they are living on, except from a short period of expanding European colonization. Those in charge of education curricula and the accompanying accreditation standards at either the K through 12 or university content areas have no background to even begin the process of revisioning educational systems to incorporate the indigenous knowledges of the Americans. However, for the past 40 years, there's been an increase studies and educational research that encourages the incorporation of postmodernist and post-colonial thought into what we call higher education. The purpose of this discussion is to point out that while the new material expands the consciousness and usefulness of education in a new globally aware world, there is still a need to look under our collective feet and ask, quote, where is the wisdom and knowledge and history from where we are living now? After several hundred years of importing educational systems from across the pond, is it not possible to focus on what is here from indigenous sources? When deciding how to aboriginalize, in quote, curricula in British Columbia, as well as the experience incorporating indigenous-centric knowledge into curricula at two institutions in Washington State in the 1990s, one was Heritage University of the Yakima Indian Nation, and the Evergreen State College, where I directed a reservation-based program on 5 different reservations. The problem was addressed by consulting indigenous community members. There are still communities of indigenous people in the quote-unquote New World, which may come as a surprise to many educators because that their own education has original Americans seen as parts of a disappeared past. In fact, this is well, in most curricula, it is taught under the banner of Manifest Destiny, in which superior Christian European colonists moved across the continent as a foregone and God-given culmination of history blessed by accepted enlightened logic. What came of consulting the community members when I was doing this was varied, but high on the list of course content was the need to address current community living concerns. This included social, environmental, the economic, and health studies. But also there were many who wanted more foregrounding in language and culture from the Americas, not only of Europe. Attached to this was the importance for students to develop critical thinking skills. Part of the need for critical thinking is that indigenous communities need to be rebuilt. If we borrow a piece of wisdom from indigenous Americans, our higher education institutions need to begin incorporating critical thinking that asks the question, why are we not looking at the knowledge from where we live now? Examples from the British Columbia effort to aboriginalize social work courses included thinking of different forms of authority, elders and women having high status as knowledge keepers in communities rather than patriarchal systems based on scribe status. Therefore, elders were often a part of the implicit curriculum of the universities. Also, looking at what had worked over time to keep community members healthy, mentally, spiritually, and physically, incorporating a different science based on relationships with parts of the world considered alive, but dead in European perspectives. As one elder answered when I asked in my class if rocks are alive, replied, not all, but some. Questions of our relationship to our location and place incorporates thinking of the earth as a living entity, as are animate forms of nature such as lightning, rain, and rivers, which in some cases are even considered alive in our languages. The emphasis on gender, for example, in the largest language family in North America, Algonquin, sees the world not as male or female, gender not as male or female linguistically, but rather animate or inanimate. People ask me for how do I designate your pronoun or whatever. I said, living. It's animate. With this approach, not all rocks are alive, but some are. Science could benefit by thinking less in hierarchical and linear terms and models and become more circular. In social work, an emphasis on community healing and restitution seen through alternatives to our incarceration, foster care, child removal, and the incorporation of more holistic healing, including spiritual, auditory, through song, drum, rattle, olfactory, through sweetgrass, cedar, sage, smudging, things like that, sensational, such as sweat baths and dancing, into the medicine bag of practitioners. Most important to this might be a shift philosophically by changing from a hierarchical linear worldview toward one that is more holistic. In this system, dividing people simplistically on criteria such as darkness or lightness, as in the European taxonomic attempt to classify races, disappears. Gender and age differences are not primary. The idea of who leads and decides for others might shift to more toward democracy and all versions of the hierarchical tyranny of the few, even into the development of social and healthcare curriculum. A beginning list of educational vision that may benefit from millennia of indigenous knowledge includes agricultural, medical, and plant knowledges, revising gender studies, as many indigenous societies are matrilineal and matriarchal with specific knowledges and teachings reserved for women, architectural design from indigenous systems of aquaculture, irrigation, terracing, and harmony with physical landscapes, multi-generational, community-based decision-making models that help with research models looking at more than the needs of a few. Additional emphasis on multilingualism, which in many indigenous communities also includes sign language. There would be many more. I've got not much time. Give place a chance, all my relations. That's it. Anybody? Should I run now? Or
We'll take questions. We'll have questions at the end for all of the panelists. Great, thank you. So our next presenter is Frida Frank. Syllabus made the screen. I'll tell you just really quick. Thank you. Okay. So my paper looked at some of the holes within welfare, well, some of the intersections between welfare policy and Black women's vulnerability to intimate partner violence. A lot of times like, when we look at policy, we look at it from like a one-dimensional standpoint, and we can kind of address some of the issues with it, but we don't necessarily stop and take a minute to see how like these policies can also like impact other people's vulnerabilities to things that they're already experiencing. So that's what we'll chat about today. So what we commonly know as the Welfare Reform Act that was instituted by the Clinton administration is called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1997. Some people call it PRWORA. I'm going to call it welfare reform because that's what it is. But it was signed into legislation in 97 by former President Clinton. And some of the goals of that policy was to promote quick exits from the welfare rolls by emphasizing employment, marriage, parental involvement, and reliance in kin rather than the government. And we can kind of just like look at that and pull out a lot of things and be like, ugh, right? It's kind of problematic. Okay. So before we get into how it impacts Black women, just from like a policy standpoint, I think it's good for us to just kind of understand what type of policy like the welfare reform policy was. So just off the basis of it, it's what we would call a rational positive policy, which means that in order for it to be passed, they use, so in policy you like identify a problem, and the problem of like welfare reform and the idea that we need reform for welfare was based on quantitative data. And for folks who are strictly about numbers, quantitative data might be okay because you can say, well, this is the problem and this is how we prove it. This X amount of people receiving these benefits, this is how much it's gonna cost us. But from a social services perspective, we say, okay, but numbers don't mean much, right? They mean something, but there's always contextual stuff behind that. And when you have a policy that's just based on quantitative hard numbers, we don't have the opportunity for wiggle room to kind of understand why. The next thing is that it's a social-based policy, and most social policies rely upon like the notion of worthiness and deservedness to determine one's ability to access the benefits of said policy. So meaning that you kind of have to prove why you're worthy of it. So welfare reform, you have folks who are obviously in need of services. Well, why, right? And if you meet this criteria, then you're worthy and you're okay.
versus if you don't meet that criteria, then you're not worthy. So we can kind of look at that with just like the different narratives between white women who receive governmental assistance and black women who receive governmental assistance, right? There's a lot more wiggle room and who's determined as like a person who's really needing this and they're gonna use it to benefit themselves versus someone who's gonna be criminalized for that. The next thing is that it's punitive based. So once we get into it, you'll see that there's like sanctions and punishments that are attached to that. That's not necessarily good for a lot of reasons. And then lastly, a lot of like the language within the welfare reform policy was constructed around some of the negative images associated with black womanhood and just black women's identities. So, common stereotypes of black women, I'm sure we have all heard them, but you have, and a lot of these have originated during like the American legacy of slavery. And then as, you know, time progresses, they have evolved into different things. So you have your asexual mammy. Asexual, she's typically presented as stereotypically unattractive. She is overweight, traditionally dark-skinned, and takes care of everyone's children. Then you have your sapphire. Sapphire now in modern day terms would be called like the angry black woman, like black woman. So she's very hyper-aggressive, violent, combative. And sapphire will come up again when we're looking at some of the ways that women, black women who experience IPV, intimate partner violence, are treated. Jezebel, hypersexual, a seductress. She has a lot of children. Well, Jezebel has turned into the welfare queen. So I'm sure that we all are familiar with that one. So that actually came out to play during the Reagan administration. And he, you know, the things that we have to like have reform for welfare because these women are getting rich off this, right? And they're having these babies and they're making money. And he used like this image of like the black woman pulling up into the projects, like driving the Cadillac with wearing fur coats and all of her children. And I don't know how many of you have been to the projects, but that's not what happens, right? Never seen anyone in the projects with a fur coat. And then now the modern day image that has kind of evolved during the 90s is the teen mom, right? And so what they'll say is that the teen mom is actually the daughter of the welfare queen. And so she's learned how to scam the government from her mother, and because her mother has so many children, she doesn't necessarily see an issue with having children. So she's young and she has babies, and the idea is that her babies are going to be taking care of the government, hence is why we need welfare reform. So, for black women, there's some stats on black women experiencing intimate partner violence. I like acronyms, so we're going to call it IPV. So 22% of black women will experience sexual violence within their lifetimes. 40% of black women will experience intimate partner violence within their lifetimes. There's some data that has come out that's pretty controversial that says that outside of natural causes, the #1 cause of death for black women will be at the hands of their intimate partner, and particularly by a firearm, right? So sometimes, you know, when we're having these conversations, well, people will say, well, all people experience IPV or all women experience IPV, and that's absolutely true. But when you look at the percentages of like the numbers of black women, just particularly in the United States, and how the numbers and their prevalences of intimate partner violence, it absolutely is a public health issue, and we need to address it as such. Now, gender-based violence against black women is a result of like the intersections of historical, systematic, and cultural oppressions. So what I mean by that is like if you go back and you trace like the origins of black women's exploitation starting with enslavement, you see that gender-based violence, whether it was physical or sexual, has just been something that has happened to black women, whether it was at the hands of white men and black men too. So one of like the narratives when we're talking about this, sometimes we focus on interracial violence against black women, but we absolutely know, particularly in our communities, that there's an issue with intraracial violence as well. Now the reasons why are a little bit different, but it's still there. Then you look at like systematic stuff. So black women not being viewed as citizens, right? So lack of citizenship means that you're not gonna be awarded that protection from whether it's policy or law enforcement or from the government. So it's just like an ongoing system of exploitation. And then cultural stuff too, because inside our community, we know that hyper-black masculinity is an issue, and then that idea of like keeping things insular. And then for black women, because of their intersecting identities, it's that idea that you have to pick, well, you're supposed to choose racial solidarity sometimes over your own well-being. So we're experiencing these things, and we're experiencing these things within our community, but given the fact that Black men deal with racism and, you know, like those notions of police brutality and some of those other things, the expectation is that Black women should kind of like put that stuff aside and center what Black men are dealing with. And we can't do that either. All right, so there's an idea, well, there's a theory that's called structural violence. So when we're looking at violence, you have your intimate partner violence, you have sexual violence, but then structural violence, which is also called administrative violence, and it's like what happens when you're going to seek support, right? So structural violence is defined as any constraint on human potential due to economic and political circumstances that structure or activate inequality. We see it so often within like the social service like realm that we don't even notice it sometimes, and it almost seems as ordinary because we've been institutionalized. And we're all kind of familiar with the notion of intersectionality, I'm sure, right? So structural violence resides at the intersection of racism, classism, sexism, and gender discrimination. And what it ultimately does is that it strips citizens of their freedom of movement, choice of occupation, income, wealth, and the social basis for self-respect. So I'm going to get into some of those things that we see within the welfare reform policies, and you'll kind of understand that. So in 1999, they initiated what is called the Family Violence Option Amendment, and that was an amendment that gave states the permission to, one, screen for domestic violence, both for candidates applying for assistance and those being dropped from assistance programs, refer victims of domestic violence to counseling, and three, make a determination whether certain welfare requirements should be waived for abused women, such as time limits, having to apply for child support, and work requirements that would unfairly penalize women for mandates that they may not be able to meet while leaving a relationship. So this has been adopted by 41 states, but we also know that with policy, sometimes just because something is written down doesn't necessarily mean that it's implemented, and implementation is very subjective sometimes, and it looks differently in different places. All right, so one of the biggest problems with the welfare reform is that it's punitive, right? And it relies on threats and punishments to maintain clients' participation. So one of the ways that it does that is like you have to be compliant. But again, what does compliance mean? And someone's non-compliance could be related to abuse that they're dealing with. So, I had a tangent. Okay, so when I was working in community-based agencies, you know, women would have to attend meetings, right? They would, one of the things with them, they would have to attend a certain amount of meetings, and if you didn't attend those meetings, you would be deemed non-compliant. Now, if you have a partner who is abusive and one doesn't even know that you have to do this, or they're clocking where you're going, or you don't have access to transportation, you're not able to do that. So now you're going to be deemed non-compliant, and if you're deemed non-compliant, that can directly relate to, like, you know, affect your benefits. And sometimes your benefits can be terminated. And one of the texts that I was reading, the woman needed to go to like a work release program because, you know, one part of welfare reform is that they have like those welfare to work classes. Her partner wouldn't let her leave the house and purposely, you know, took away her access to transportation and money to do so. So she lost her food stamps. After she lost her food stamps, when her partner found out about it, he became extremely physically abusive and beat her really badly, right? So the idea is that, especially when you're dealing with someone who's already being victimized, why add a punishment to that instead of finding another way that you can kind of meet them where they are? Another thing that the welfare reform policy did is that they wanted to institute this family cap. So go back to thinking about like those images of like the welfare queen and like the teen mom. And what the family cap aimed to do was to eliminate any perceived financial incentive for women receiving welfare to have more children, right? And we can all kind of side-eye or roll our eyes on that, because if you know anyone who's received governmental benefits, they're not getting a lot of money. You're not getting rich off welfare, right? In 1996, 22 states adopted family cap mandates, and this policy is still upheld in 18 states. Now, how this was done, it could be encouraging birth control, and sometimes even just looking at what your insurance, if you're on state insurance that comes along with your governmental benefits, will cover. So for like the state of Connecticut, our state insurance is called Husky. Husky doesn't cover a lot of different forms of birth control, but they do cover abortions, you know? So things like that get kind of tricky. But you can get Viagra if you're on Husky, you know? So there's different conversations to be had about certain things like that. And there's other like incentives, like, well, if you are in this program and you get your tubes tied, or just even being a single mom who is receiving governmental benefits, how getting your tubes tied is presented to you versus not. And when we're looking at someone, again, who's already been victimized, one of the primary things we want to do is make sure that they have agency. So if you're feeling as if, okay, I have to do this in order to maintain my benefits, even if a person consents to doing so, there's still really not that much agency there, because a mom is always going to pick something that's going to better her children versus not going to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Go back.
Oh, you want to go back?
Yeah, no, go back.
Okay.
And then so another thing, in 2005, as like an addendum to this, the Bush administration instituted what they called healthy marriage classes, right? Again, we can roll our eyes. And what healthy marriage classes does is that they provided, because the idea is like, we're going to keep these families together and we're going to get fathers involved and engaged with their children. So they had like couples counseling, and they had healthy relationships classes, and all these things with the idea that we're going to push people to marriage. Now, anyone who works in like the domestic violence realm knows that one of the things that you would never, ever, 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 ever do is recommend couples counseling, right? That's a power dynamic, it's unequal, and again, you're increasing someone's vulnerability to violence. And then if this person is not, if she's like in the process of leaving a situation, or she has left the situation, to potentially say, you know what, in order to maintain these benefits, you and this person, because you have children with this person, you all need to be in X amount of classes and participate in this program. Again, you're not giving that woman a lot of agency. And then there's still some other issues with that too, where the idea that if you're receiving benefits, and particularly in the state of Connecticut, if you're receiving any benefits, the father of your children need to be notified, right? And so that kind of, they say that it's not, well, it's supposed to be able to garner child support, but what it also does is put women at risk. Because if you're living in a shelter, or if you have no communication with that person, or if there's an active protective order, you don't need that person knowing what you're doing, and sometimes men become combative about it. But then a lot of times it also forces women to stay in these relationships. So I've worked with women who have like full protective orders in place, but because they know that because they know that this person, if they leave, this person is still going to be forced to be in their lives, they'll just maintain and stay in that relationship, because the absence of that person being there could negatively affect the benefits that they're receiving. The next slide now. So, in conclusion, right? First thing is that welfare reform should be reconstructed to incorporate the intersectional and specific needs of Black women, as well as other marginalized populations. So again, with policy, sometimes like what looks good in theory just doesn't necessarily work in practice. So you have to, I would say you have to meet people where they are, but you also have to account for different things. So whether it's like cultural stuff. So if you're working with someone and you say, well, you know, if something happens, you need to just be able to call the police. Even in my big age, I'm still frightened about calling the police, right? That's just not something that I'm comfortable with. So you look at someone who is even further marginalized than I am, and you have to account for that. In Connecticut particularly, there's a program that's called Fathers for Change, and they have like the outside of it is called Mothers for Change. So if you experience an intimate partner violence incident, you and your partner are mandated to participate in this 6-month program where you get in-home services. Some of the issues with that is that in addition to it being run by the state, it's also funded through DCF, right? And now you add DCF into the situation, and it gets even worse. And in my experiences, I've seen women have their children removed from the home because the DCF workers did not feel as if they would call the police if something happened, right? Now, once your children are removed from your home, you know, it's easy to take kids from the house. It's hard to get these babies back in the house. So then what are you doing in this situation? And a lot of times women will just say, I'm not calling the police, I don't want DCF involved, I'm not doing anything, because that fear of losing their children is there. And sometimes like calling the police might not be the best thing to do, right? We can safety plan, we can figure something out, and we can make a strategy versus you doing that that's gonna really put your children into danger. And if you call the police, you still gotta go back into your community. You still have to go back into those spaces. So again, what does that look like? The next thing is that the policy needs to be shifted from punitive-based to an empowerment-based model, right? So what about instead of if there was like a punishment attached to it, really like meeting these women and talking to them and seeing what they need. One thing that kind of frustrates me is that we have like this one-size-fits-all notion of empowerment. What's empowering to me is not empowering to somebody else, right? So for someone else, just being able to go to a job interview is empowering, or being able to take your baby to the park is empowering. And we have to have space for that in there instead of saying, well, if you don't do this, you're gonna get punished, because abuse is abuse, whether it's happening at the hands of your partner or whether it's happening from the state, right? And we don't want someone to go from one form of victimization to another form of victimization, nor do we want to justify victimization just because you're in a position of power. The last thing is that there needs to be some amendments in there that includes sexual and intimate partner violence training for welfare case managers. Sometimes people think, well, I have a social service background, I know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing. And we need to kind of account for that, because screening looks different, safety planning looks different, working with people looks different, and just even for like folks in the field. So my approach to working with students is completely different to my approach that I had when I was working in the community, and I have to account for that. Not every victim looks the same, and a lot of times when women are coming in, and I've seen it in my experiences as well, we have this idea of like what the stereotypical victim looks like. So she's crying, and she's beat up, and she's really upset. But that doesn't really happen sometimes, especially when you're working in marginalized communities, where strength is something that's always like impressed upon, you know what I mean? And the last thing that you're gonna do, especially in public and especially to an outsider, is perform being a victim. So they're gonna come in and they're gonna be stone-faced. And they might be angry, and they might swear, and they might curse, but that's okay because it's for a reason. I'm just gonna use like a small short story, but a couple years ago I was working in the community, and I had a young woman who was 23 and had 4 babies. I started working on her case in the wintertime. She had a big window like this in the front of her home, and her partner at the time had busted her window out. She lived in governmental housing, so what they did was they came and put trash bags over her windows and cardboard. This is in Connecticut in the wintertime. It's cold. She was receiving welfare benefits. She was receiving Section 8. She was on the verge of getting evicted from her Section 8 and losing her voucher because of the damages to her home, but the damages were related to the intimate partner violence. Because she wasn't able to make meetings, they were saying that she wasn't compliant with DCF and with her welfare case manager. So during the eviction, and now it's April and she still doesn't have a window, right? I'm helping her figure out what's gonna be her next step. She called her case manager at DCF, and she may have cussed the case manager out. She called her case manager down at the welfare and cussed them out too. So now we're all in a meeting together with her providers, and they're saying, well, you know what? At this point, we just need to close her case, and we're just gonna take the kids because her attitude is bad, right? So I say, do you have windows? And they're like, yes. I'm like, well, she hasn't had a window, right? In her home with these kids since the winter time. I'll cuss you out too, you know? And a lot of times, like when we're making these policies, and this is something I always go back to because I always say like the pleasure to be able to like work with people and like see their growth, but a lot of times these policies are being made by people who are so not connected or just so far removed that they're just looking at those quantitative numbers and they're looking at those hard facts, and they're not necessarily thinking that these are people and these are people's lives. In the same way that we all are striving to have like an enhanced quality of life, we should be doing the same thing for everybody else. So that is my conclusion, and I am done. Thank you.
That's not a big PowerPoint, just a couple of images. That's not a big deal. So, my paper is about California SB 48, California's Fair Education Act. And really, this paper is really thinking about California's Fair Education Act through the lens of knowledge production and also through the lens of sexual citizenship. So, you know, as we know, as we talk about in our program, knowledge production is never neutral. It's always political. Facts are never without social meaning. In public school curriculum, debates about what should be included often reflect larger debates about ideology, conceptions of morality, and struggles to maintain or disrupt hegemonic narratives that reflect white and patriarchal heteronormative perspectives. In this paper, considering the implications of SB 48, we want to think about how SB 48 reflects these debates about white patriarchal heteronormative perspectives. That's what's at the center of this legislation. Legislation and public policy can be a tool for engaging in the politics of knowledge production. However, legislation itself will not transform our current practices. So, analyzing the policy process from the passage of SB 48 to the adoption of curriculum standards shows us that each step in the process is a site of contest. Who decides what should be included? Who sets the standards for curriculum? What constitutes inclusion, in this case of LGBTQ content? And also want to reflect on the broader implications of why LGBT inclusive curriculum matter to LGBTQ students, and to all students, and also to the recognition and status of LGBTQ people in the United States. And this is part of a larger project, so this part is sort of about kind of the you know, theoretical framework underlying the larger project, and then the next phase of the project, which I'm not going to talk about today, is actually looking at the adoption of curriculum standards and then measuring the implementation and the extent to which the policy actually leads to inclusion of LGBTQ content in the actual classroom. So during the past 10 years, the United States has been experiencing widespread changes in policies affecting LGBTQ individuals, including changes to marriage laws, legalization of same-sex marriage at state and federal levels, the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, expanding laws prohibiting bullying based on sexual orientation in schools, expansion of protections in workplaces. However, in contrast, most recently, what we have been witnessing is the current presidential administration repealing many of those measures, particularly under the guise of the expansion of religious liberties. In 2011, California passed Senate Bill 48, which made changes to the Education Code section 51204.5. The code prescribes the inclusion of the contributions of various groups in the history of California and the United States. And so, okay, so it's the fair, accurate, inclusive, and respectful is what the Fair Education Act stands for. And then we can take a look at who these groups are that are supposed to be included under the Fair Education Act. The new language included prescribes that the contributions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans, quote, to the economic, political, and social development of California and the United States of America must be included along with other groups. The review of instructional materials took place in 2017, and implementation is forthcoming. There are 3 other states who, since this time, have also passed similar legislation, including Illinois, Colorado, and New Jersey. Massachusetts has issued guidelines, but has not passed legislation. In contrast, there are a handful of states, including Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas, that have passed what are referred to as no promo homo policies that actively prohibit schools from teaching anything that, quote, promotes homosexuality, which includes portraying LGBTQ people in any kind of positive light in educational settings. Including the contributions of LGBTQ people in public school curriculum constitutes a public recognition of their value as citizens and their place in history. It also represents a move toward recognizing LGBTQ people in a way that does not simply reduce them to sexual acts, but instead recognizes their full humanity. In the executive summary of the History Social Science Framework for for California Public Schools in 2018, the new curriculum is explained as focusing on content, one of 4 key areas in the curriculum. The authors explain that one central theme that cuts across U.S. history curriculum is freedom. And they say, students consider the ways in which quests for liberty, freedom, and equality have transformed the American populace. Starting with the freedoms outlined by the framers of the U.S. Constitution, students examine the many contributions of Americans seeking to define the meaning of citizenship across the country, including farmers in Jefferson's agrarian nation, suffragists at the end of the 19th century, civil rights activists putting their lives on the line to end Jim Crow, and discriminatory social norms in the middle of the 20th century, and Americans seeking to bring marriage equality to same-sex couples in the 21st century. So you can see that they're aligning LGBT history, in this case, LGBT social movements, as relating to other movements that have questioned or sought to expand our definitions of what freedom and inclusiveness looks like. Okay? Students are introduced to diverse families, including LGBTQ families in the 2nd grade. So this is important because one of the things that we hear in response to efforts to include LGBTQ histories in the curriculum are questions about sex, right? Are we going to be talking about anal sex in the 2nd grade? Right, that's the kind of response that we get, right? This is a homosexual agenda trying to teach our kids about sex, right? And so to give you some context, what is it that we're talking about? We're talking about something like in the 2nd grade, when there are books about families, you know, there might be a book that features same-sex families, right? This inclusion of LGBT histories is one small aspect of a curriculum designed to engage students in critical thinking, right? That's what's underlying these curriculum changes, is to approach history, social science, right, social studies, all of these different subjects from a place of critical thinking about the historical, economic, and geographic dimensions of social change from migration to conceptions of who is a citizen to issues like climate change. Can I ask somebody to just keep time because I forgot to bring my phone up with me? I'm good. Okay.
15 minutes. 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So the concept of sexual citizenship has emerged over the past few decades as a theoretical tool for analyzing the ways that certain sexualities and intimate relationships render people as bad citizens. And those in the gender, sexuality, and public policy class read a lot about this concept of sexual citizenship last semester. And it's something that I've been excited about in my own work, as you know, through the years as I've explored different areas of gender, sexuality, and policy, thinking about how to talk about what it is that we're talking about in terms of how policy regulates or prescribes what kinds of intimate relationships and family relationships need to be regulated and what kinds are celebrated. So this lens has been used to analyze policies such as same-sex marriage, women receiving public welfare. One aspect of sexual citizenship is the idea of recognition. Recognition can mean many things, including the recognition of one's relationship through formal means like marriage or adoption. Jill Josephson, in her book Rethinking Sexual Citizenship, states that policies in the US, quote, engage in sexual regulation as a form of exclusionary and disciplinary politics. And she goes on to say that this idea, quote, involves a citizen who is white, heterosexual, and sexually continent, meaning whose sexuality is controlled and contained in culturally and politically acceptable ways. This is the hegemonic idea of sexual citizenship, an ideal that is primarily a fantasy, right? So in other words, we're promoting and regulating and maintaining this ideal that in fact doesn't reflect the reality of many of the people in our United States. And as such, it becomes the standard to which we are supposed to respond, right? Forever placing those who do not fit that model as being outside, and outside being abnormal. And abnormal meaning suspect, deviant, and needing to be regulated. So while Josephson focuses on abstinence-only sex education, the Defense of Marriage Act, and welfare policy, the framework easily lends itself to the topic of public education curriculum. Conceptions of who is a good citizen are communicated not only through the active regulation and criminalization of behavior, but also by who's included and who's left out of our curriculum. When we learn stories of good citizens, think about the kinds of things that we include in textbooks in elementary school, right? Stories of role models and good citizens, the people who built this great country, right? And I'm always reminded of like 4th grade. I can really clearly remember for some reason this 4th grade textbook where there was like a photo and 2 pages on some historical figure, right? The majority of whom were white men, with maybe there was like Martin Luther King and you know, Jr., and there might have been like Susan B. Anthony might have gotten a page in there, and that was like it, right, in the textbook. That's who got included. Right? That communicates really, really powerful messages about who are good citizens, who are essential, and who have, you know, created our country, whose stories matter. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit here. So our public school curriculum reflects a stigma against same-sex relationships and LGBTQ identities. Critics might ask why it matters. But shouldn't historical figures like Bayard Rustin, Harvey Milk, Audre Lorde, Sylvia Rivera be included? How can we include them without recognizing or mentioning their sexual orientation or gender identity? How do we tell their stories and their influence on our country and leave those details out of who they are, who they were? Our approach in the past has been to not talk about them at all, for the fear of talking about what I just talked about. To talk about Harvey Milk would be to say that Harvey Milk was gay, would be to talk about anal sex to 2nd graders, right? Somehow that is what equates in critics' heads. So we cannot talk about it at all. We cannot include it in the curriculum. What this does is it contributes to a false assumption that heterosexuality is universal, and that heterosexuality and being cisgender, which we talked about in my last session, right? Meaning that your gender identity is the same as what your sex was assigned at birth, that those things are natural, are universal, are expected, and are what is normal and celebrated in our culture. And that those are the people who matter. Those are the good citizens. Good citizens are heterosexual, good citizens are cisgender. And if you're not those things, you are not a good citizen, and we won't be talking about you for your whole educational career, basically. I mean, we're talking about a long time here, right? K to 12. So some things to keep in mind about why this matters. LGBTQ youth are disproportionately at risk for several factors associated with poor mental health. It's well documented that LGBTQ youth experience higher rates of victimization, higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of suicidal behaviors, as well as a greater likelihood of being homeless. However, while these health disparities have been well documented, research suggests that environment matters. Raifman and colleagues in their study found that youth suicide risk was reduced in states that implemented same-sex marriage policies. So if you think about that, that's not even something that is directly about school curriculum or school environment, but just living in a state that had passed same-sex marriage policies reduced youth suicide risk, right? And you can think about why. Perhaps they could see themselves becoming adults. Perhaps it changed their idea about whether they were included in who was, a respected citizen. They found that legal marriage was associated with a significant decrease in the proportion of high school students attempting suicide. And so it suggests that the efforts to reduce mental health disparities among LGBTQ youth and adults are not only about individual interventions to provide mental health services, but should be about reducing structural inequalities and institutional discrimination. In 2017, the American Educational Research Association dedicated an entire issue of their journal, Educational Researcher, to the topic of LGBTQ issues in education. In their statement announcing the release of this special issue, the directors cited changing policies and laws pertaining to LGBTQ rights. And that despite these changing policies and laws, that there continue to be unique challenges that LGBTQ students face in educational settings. And they noted a need to promote, quote, safe, inclusive environments throughout all American schools. Prior to this, they called on educators to the education research community to redouble its commitment to examining how bigotry can be eliminated and respect for diverse communities fostered in educational settings. There's been a big change in the way we research and the topics we research in LGBTQ education. So if we go back to 1977, some people probably weren't born yet in 1977, but in 1977, in the Gallup poll, only 27% of respondents thought that gay and lesbian people should be hired to teach in elementary school. Right? So they didn't want, it's almost 75% of the respondents said that they did not want gay and lesbian teachers to be hired. By 2019, there's almost a complete reversal in that attitude, with 81% responding that LGBTQ people should be hired to teach in elementary school. So our public opinion has shifted quite a lot during this time. In terms of the way that educational research has happened between 1970 and 2010, there have been kind of progressive themes over time, beginning with homosexuality is a social contagion, to homosexuality is a private identity, right? That sort of, we don't care what you do as long as it remains behind closed doors. When it gets out of the closed doors, we care a lot what you do. To LGBT youth as seen as an at-risk population, to LGBTQ youth being seen as victims, to more recently, LGBTQ youth as seen as resilient, which is a really different framing from viewing them as somehow problematic or at risk, right, or in danger by the nature of their identity, to seeing them as resilient against the structural inequalities, discrimination, and negative environments in which they live. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about school and curriculum. So several studies have examined the extent to which inclusive curriculum exists in the first place and how it might have positive or negative effects. Bishop and Atlas surveyed school psychologists to find out how well LGBTQ families were being served in their districts. They found that only 23% of districts used LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. Okay, so only 23% had LGBT inclusive curriculum, and of those, 89% reported that that was informal, meaning that it was not that there was a formal curriculum that included LGBTQ issues or histories, but that specific teachers, specific schools, right, included things. Specific librarians included books in their library. That's what I mean by informal. only 3 districts reported having an actual formal curriculum to teach about LGBTQ families in their schools. So the conclusion that I want to leave you with is that, and also to mention that inclusion itself isn't enough, right? So often what we have is negative inclusion, right? We have inclusion of these topics, but they're negative representations, right? We talk about sex education and we talk about AIDS as being associated, and that's one of the few times that we might hear anything about being gay, right? Is a negative connotation. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that representation matters, that learning about LGBTQ people who have made contributions affects these young people. It allows them to see the possibilities for themselves, who they could become, you know, leaders, social leaders, change makers, important contributors to their societies. Not including LGBTQ people and stories in the curriculum supports the assumption that heterosexuality is universal. If I never see it, I think it doesn't exist. And if it does exist, then somehow it's negative, right? It's stigmatized, it's abnormal, and it's therefore suspect, right? Criminal, even if it's not criminal, which it's not, right? So the erasure of LGBTQ people is a reflection of our definition of who gets to be a citizen, and who gets to be a good citizen, and whose stories get to be told. You can be LGBTQ, or you can be a good citizen, deserving of recognition, but you cannot be both. And to also remind us that the politics of knowledge is always political, right? And so even in things that we may not be thinking about all the time, right? Our textbooks that kids are encountering in the 4th grade. That 4th grade of who gets included in that one-page profile is a political contest, right? A debate over whose lives matter in our country, whose stories are worth being told, and who do we consider citizens, essential citizens of our nation. Okay. Okay, great. So why don't we open it up for questions and comments for our presenters? We have a few minutes, we have about 10 minutes for discussion. Do we have any questions or comments? Yeah.
I have a question for Frida. I thought your presentation was very informative, and what I wanted to ask you was, when they're implementing all these like policies about sanctions, do they have any like data that shows that these policies are actually working, or are they just, you know, is there any? Are they saying, okay, from this for this 1 year we've seen like this decrease in, you know, this policy, or, you know, is there any proof that they're going by?
Yeah, I mean, well,
if that makes sense.
If the goal of the policy is to ultimately like save money, and if someone is removed from the program, they're not going to say why. It's just, well, we saved, it's a line item, we saved X amount of dollars, so it doesn't really account for anything. So if you're just looking at, again, just numbers, it's like, oh, well, we started with X amount of people on these services, now we have X amount of people. It decreased, so it's working, and not that it's being done because people are getting kicked off.
So there's just like a numbers game.
As opposed to if the goal is poverty or something like that, right? Comments, questions? Yeah, I was really struck by your presentation too, because before going into research, academia stuff, I was a welfare caseworker. And you know, the way that intimate partner violence was still, yeah, like at that point, and this was a big like advance, right? Intimate partner specialist in the room, right? Who you could refer somebody to. But the big thing was about restraining orders. If you didn't have a restraining order, you weren't considered being in an intimate partner violence relationship. And I wonder if you've encountered that, you know, these sort of things as barriers, right? Like how do you prove it, and then.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot too with like the U visas. So like with the U visa, it's a temporary visa that you can get if you are an undocumented person and you're experiencing like any form of violence, because gang violence is in it too, but for like intimate partner violence in particular. And one of the things is that you have to prove that you're a victim, and you have to prove that you're a threat. So people aren't taking pictures of certain things. And for, you know, restraining orders, the restraining orders have to show that that person poses a threat to you right now at that moment. So you're going in, and the application is pretty long. So in Connecticut, the application is a couple pages long. You're going into court, you're filling out the application, and they have a narrative section, and you just have to write. And then it goes to the judge, and it's at the discretion of the judge whether or not they want to approve it. But then after that, the next half of the battle is getting it served to the person, so, which is another all-day thing. You need to have an address, you need to have a phone number, but there is nothing that's guaranteeing this person's safety in between there. So a lot of people don't do that, and if you get called an ex parte restraining order, it's only good for 2 weeks. After that 14 days is up, you have to go back to court for that, and you lose a lot of people for that too. And if someone is working, you know, a lot of low-income jobs, you don't have time off, you're getting paid hourly. How does that account for it in your kids? So a lot of women, they just don't.
Yeah.
I did, I was direct service child protection social worker for 8 years, in addition did emergency mental health, lots of different things. The bottom line in social work is there is lots of literature and studies that have been done. We know this stuff is not working for human beings. It really is, just getting back to a comment made earlier, it's political. I mean, who is chosen to make testimony and be paid attention to? I want to make a quick comment too. I apologize for not throwing that other issue in what I was talking about, was the whole issue of gender. In indigenous perspectives from North America and South America, there's more than 2 genders when you're talking, I talked about it in terms of animate and inanimate, but you've got 5 genders within some of our I mean, it's not just, a 3rd gender that usually, sometimes there'll be a footnote mention, or there's a 3rd gender like Navajo culture. So there's actually in a lot of our cultures 5 genders. The term two-spirit was simply because there's so many genders in our cultures. That came up at a conference in 1989 where a compromise was made between people. Said, well, we're talking to people in English, what are we going to use? And the Anishinaabe people said, well, we've got a word that might work, it's called two-spirit. Actually, there's many more definitions. When you're linguistically chauvinistic, in a sense, where English is the only basis, there's a political reason why English is talked about, because it indexes a reality where women are in a certain category, where people that disseminate money, I mean, the hierarchy is they want rich people like the kings and everything to dispense money to the poor and then be thanked for that. Therefore, any system that works possibly to take people out of poverty, it's not community decision-making. I mean, when you talk about family conferences, when it's based on a fictional model of something called the nuclear family, where's the grandmother, where's the, and then they develop this term called fictive kin, because it doesn't fit into that kinship model. Where's Uncle Mike, who's the person that is the support system for that family in there. He can't get reimbursement financially. Or what about a lot of times the natural helper in the community is a woman, an older woman especially, with a lot of power, knowing everybody in the community. She doesn't get the financial resources to help the people. She'd be much better to spend. We know this. We have studies that show that natural helpers in communities do much better. Speaking in 1977, this is embarrassing to say, but we did a big natural helper network study in 1977 who people actually in communities go to for help. It certainly isn't the welfare agents.
Right.
Because you get condescended on, you get all kinds of, you dissed and everything, you are not in a very good place. And when you were saying, every woman in my family circle has had violence. I'll get into, the men have had a lot of it too, but, in my person, my sister was killed. And I don't want to talk about some of my other relatives. But the bottom line is, in our communities, things are not working very well. But that serves the purposes. I mean, we know this. This is almost becomes rhetorical. My encouragement to all of you great academics is, how are we going to change curriculum? I mean, look at what Texas is doing. They are trying to control everything in the textbooks. If by the time you get done with high school, anything we introduce to them that's at all different, in their first college sociology course even, I remember somebody standing up in a class once accusing a sociology professor of being a communist. Are you a communist? And all through their whole...
I had a question about that though, because I know, I think New Jersey has, implemented a policy where they're gonna have LGBTQ inclusive education, and you see people who are so outraged by it. But then you look at the number of children who are identifying very early and then experiencing bullying and how they're just not making those connections. But then if it's a federal, I guess like if they make it where, well now they're trying to like take it out of the schools, but then some states are already implementing it. Could they be criminalized or like penalized for implementing something that the federal government is saying that we're trying to do away from?
So the federal government doesn't have a law prohibiting, right? That is a sort of state by state level. So I don't think that it would be criminalized, right? I think it's going to be like a state by state passage, or passage of either the no promo homo or the passage of LGBT inclusive curriculum. I think what's trickier is that the process, I didn't talk about the process, but the process to change the curriculum, right, is so extensive. It is years and years later, right? And so it includes, the passing the law, right, of the act, right? And then a setting forth of guidelines. What would that mean? And then reviewing textbooks. So hundreds and hundreds of people reviewing textbooks, making textbook recommendations, and then the implementation from the state level to the county level, to the district level, to the school level, to the classroom. So then the question of how much of this is actually going to get into the classroom and how much of it will become, so there are things like textbooks putting forth books that include curriculum, what inclusive curriculum might look like. But then we're still dependent on the school district level, school district politics. Lots of decisions get made in school district politics, to the principal, to the actual teacher in the classroom. So I think that's something that I'm working on this with an alum from the PhD program who was involved in the textbook reviews. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to actually see how much actually makes it into the actual classroom.
And how long
what happens with the school districts when they come to adopt, this curriculum? What happens with the individual teachers, right?
We're technically out of time, but anybody's welcome to stay longer and keep talking. I just thought I should.
Oh yeah, because we got people outside trying to get
And if
nervous.
anybody wants a copy
Thank
of
you
my
everybody
talk,
for coming to our
wait for
session.
starting campfire.
Oh yeah, Dr. Tabora has extra copies of his paper, and I'm sure that either Peter or I would be happy to
It's
share.
good for starting a campfire in the summer if you don't want to read it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just first draft.
Excellent job.
That's within the circles I travel academically, and especially in Canada now that's become the norm. I've got all the way people saying she and witch now, which is Spanish Navigate for thanks a lot. So now we can't use that anymore. We have to get other language ones. But no, it's becoming normalized more in Canada because of the Truth and Reconciliation stuff that's been passed. However, here in the United States,
A whole nother story.
it's just amazing.
I think that when people, when they are in those, I think Mel has one. Pretty good.